This shows not only a willfulness to avoid having to give the president credit, but a willful ignorance, a lying about what's going on in the Middle East, that they're not willing to give the president credit and they're downplaying this. You could not make a phone call from Dubai to Tel Aviv. Let me step back for a minute. I've mentioned this before, but let me put this in proper context for you. I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Dubai and was there from 80 to 90. And even as of 5 years ago, I've got friends who are there. Really, even just the last couple of years, up until 3-4 weeks ago, you couldn't make a phone call from Dubai to anywhere in Israel and vice versa. Israeli airline El Al was not allowed to fly over Middle Eastern airspace of those countries. Your textbooks were redacted. Any reference to Israel was stripped out, cut out, razored out, blacked out. The Israeli flag was covered. Maps were covered up. Either they were relabeled Palestine or they were just blacked out on the map. You couldn't see the Eastern Mediterranean. You go to a library, there used to be this thing called an encyclopedia. You find them online now, unless you're in the Middle East trying to look up Israel. You're not going to find it. But if you want to get a book, a World Book Encyclopedia, an Encyclopedia Britannica, and flip to a section on Israel or the Six-Day War or anything like that, you won't find it. Those pages are cut out of the encyclopedia. In the almanacs, they're cut out of there or they're blacked out as well. I mean, I remember this from school as a kid, going to the library, and you'd get to the I section and there would just be pages missing or blacked out. Typically, what would happen if there were multiple pages and Israel was on one page, you had a page on the backside that had something else. The page that had stuff on the backside, you had black marker covering out the Israel, and all the pages where the front and back were about Israel were just pulled out of the book. They didn't exist. You could go from page 511 to all of a sudden you're at page 518, and the pages in between 12 through 17, they're just gone. You could not travel. When I was a kid, you couldn't travel from Israel if you went to Israel and you had a stamp from Israel in your passport, you weren't allowed into the United Arab Emirates, which, by the way, was the freest and most open of the Middle Eastern countries, particularly Dubai. You weren't allowed in the country. If you needed to go to Israel, you had to have a removable page from your passport. Everything had to be coordinated in advance. You weren't allowed to teach it in school. You weren't allowed to talk about it in school. You weren't allowed to see it in school. I remember ninth grade, we took a class trip. And again, I grew up overseas. A lot of you won't be able to relate to this, but our class trips were to foreign countries. There really wasn't a whole lot of places to go in the desert. So we took a trip, Turkey, the Greek islands, and Greece. We mostly focused on Greece and the Greek Isles. And we went to Athens, and at the bottom of the Acropolis, the Parthenon is on a big mountain. It's one of the highest points in Athens. You can see it from all over the city. There's 1 point higher, but you can see the Parthenon from all over the city. And at the bottom is the Athens Agora, the marketplace. You've got the ancient Agora with the Temple de Hephaestus, which is well preserved. It's a beautiful area. And around it, there are shops. And I remember we were in the shops, and there were flags hanging above the street. And our teacher, our ninth grade teacher, pointed up to the flags. And there was one, it was white, had blue stripes and a star. I want to know if any of us knew what it was. And we were highly educated, well-traveled, well-informed, and none of us knew what flag that was. Maybe one or two did. But most of us had never seen it before. Wasn't in our textbooks. And we had studied the world. We had studied geography. We knew all the countries on the planet. I can't describe for you our education, learning the continents, learning each country, learning about each country. Our tests were blank maps where you had to fill out, label each country, put in the capital, put in major things, mountain ranges, things like that. I had to learn all of that stuff when I was in 8th grade. Didn't learn about Israel. Didn't know that flag. And I've still never been to Israel. I've been all over the world. I've still been to more countries than states. I've never been to Israel. And so this is a big deal. The telecommunications channels between Israel and the United Arab Emirates have been turned on now. You can call from Dubai to Tel Aviv. You can call from Jerusalem to Abu Dhabi or Sharjah. You can make those phone calls now. A month ago, you couldn't. A month ago, if El Al, Israel's airline, had mechanical problems, it couldn't land in anywhere in the United Arab Emirates or Oman or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. And now they can. Today, for the very first time, the Israeli national anthem was played from the speakers attached to the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. It's in downtown Dubai. In Bahrain, Jared Kushner has handed over scrolls for a synagogue, for a Jewish synagogue in Bahrain. It is amazing to me how the American media has willfully chosen to downplay this, particularly in light of the audio I played at the start of the show, when so many people concluded that merely by moving the Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv, or the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, war would be started. Here's John Kerry in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, left-leaning newspaper. John Kerry, Trump moving U.S. embassy to Jerusalem would lead to a Mideast explosion. Relocating the U.S. Embassy would have a profound impact on Jordan and Egypt's readiness to be supportive of Israel, Secretary of State says. Palestinian President Abbas invites Trump to visit Palestine. John Kerry said it would be an absolute explosion if the embassy was moved. The embassy was moved and war did not break out. All of the American foreign policy elite in this country insisted that this could not be done. And you know, the most galling part of this is that American presidents for decades promised to move the American embassy in Israel. American presidents for decades did this. Ronald Reagan promised it. George H.W. Bush promised it. Bill Clinton promised it. George W. Bush promised it. Barack Obama promised it. And then when Donald Trump moved it, many of the major foreign policy voices in this country freaked out about it and said it was going to lead to war. We were going to be fighting a war. Getting out of the Iran deal was going to lead to war on top of it. War upon war in the Middle East by moving the embassy. It did not happen. And now, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Oman have signed historic deals with Israel. Yesterday, after the summit at the White House, the signing of the agreements at the White House, the top stories at CNN were Louisville settles Taylor's wrongful death lawsuit. Here's what is forecast to happen after Sally makes landfall. The New York Times, DOJ opens criminal investigation into John Bolton book. At the New York Times, the top story was smoke crosses U.S. as blaze rages in the West. Trump health aide apologizes for Facebook outburst. How climate migration will reshape America. The Los Angeles Times, Bobcat fire within 500 feet of famed Mount Wilson Observatory. Been shot in the head, deputies. California wildfire maps, what's burning. Coronavirus update. USA Today. Louisville announces police reforms in wake of Breonna Taylor shooting. John Bolton's book publisher subpoenaed, DOJ investigating. Ditka again tells NFL players to get the hell out after protests. There's one little blurb in the top left corner, tiny one, says Israel signs accords with UAE, Bahrain, and White House. Only the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and the Washington Post ran the headline as their big story that there's peace in the Middle East. And then the blue checkmark brigade on social media rushed out and said, actually, Israel's never gone to war with UAE. The president had tweeted out, after decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East. Congratulations to the people of Israel and the people of the United Arab Emirates, the people of the Kingdom of Bahrain. God bless you all. Actually, they've never been at physical war. I lived over there. This shows not only a willfulness to avoid having to give the president credit, but a willful ignorance, a lying about what's going on in the Middle East, that they're not willing to give the president credit, and they're downplaying this. You could not make a phone call from Dubai to Tel Aviv. Just a couple of years ago, in fact, I had this confirmed by a correspondent who lives in Dubai, that even last year, there's no reference to Israel in books. And so now the blue checkmark brigade says, well, actually, there's really been no physical war between Israel and these countries. It's no big deal. If Barack Obama had done this, these people would be going blind in the bathroom writing about him. They'd be having to pop Viagra just to keep it going to celebrate Barack Obama doing something like this. But this is Donald Trump, and he's allowed no credit. Doesn't matter whether you like Donald Trump or not. Are you not willing to accept that the foreign policy elite in this country got it wrong when he moved the embassy? And that this actually is a really big deal. If you're not willing to recognize that, you're broken by partisanship. You're broken by partisanship in that you're unwilling to tell the truth. And I'm sorry that I'm sorry that you're that broken. Whether you like the president of the United States or not, what happened at the White House is genuinely significant. Now, there's one other great significant detail that the American media is so broken by the president and all this, even couldn't process was happening. The foreign minister for the United Arab Emirates spoke in Arabic. Why is that significant? Well, typically in the past, what has always happened is the Arabs, in dealing with Israel, they speak in English and say completely different things in Arabic. They're less effusive with praise in Arabic. Yesterday at the White House, the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates spoke in Arabic. He spoke in Arabic and began by thanking Benjamin Netanyahu for canceling several annexations. And then proceeded in Arabic to talk about peace in the Middle East and their newfound relationships and camaraderie with Israel and their willingness to open trade and commerce and friendship with Israel and to end years of essentially a Cold War in the Middle East. He said it in Arabic for Arab listeners to hear in Arabic without translators, without downplaying it, without saying stuff in English that he wouldn't say in Arabic. That was actually the most significant moment, picked up by virtually no one in the American press corps, that here you have an Arab foreign minister who typically in the past 30 years would say stuff in English about peace in the Middle East, and then in Arabic would say death to all the Jews. And here comes this guy from the United Arab Emirates in Arabic saying, live with the Jews, work with the Jews, have trade with the Jews, have peace with the Jews. He said it in Arabic, no translation needed. That was extremely significant, and everybody missed it. Because they don't want to have to give the president of the United States any credit for history. This is why so many people are turning away from the media and falling into conspiracy theory, frankly.